Late August 1944. The road between Saint-Lô and Chartres, France. Midnight. Headlights masked to slits crawl forward in an unbroken line stretching for miles. GMC 2.5-ton trucks running nose to tail, no more than 60 seconds apart, moving at a steady 25 miles an hour through darkness that swallows everything beyond the next set of taillights. The drivers, many of them awake for their second consecutive shift, with only brief stops to refuel and choke down rations, hold the wheel with the particular exhaustion of men who know that stopping is not an option written into the schedule they are following. Military police posted at intersections along the route wave each convoy through without pause, empowered to keep every other kind of traffic, jeeps, staff cars, even units moving up to the front, off these roads entirely for as long as the convoys are running, because a single stalled vehicle or a moment's hesitation at a crossroads can back up a column stretching for miles behind it. Behind them, hundreds more trucks queue at collection points near the invasion beaches, loading fuel drums, artillery shells, rations, and spare parts bound for an American army advancing faster and farther than any mechanized force in the history of warfare has yet moved. Ahead of them, George Patton's Third Army is racing east across France at a pace that is, by every conventional logistics calculation any army has previously relied upon, not supposed to be possible. Tank columns covering 40, 50, sometimes more than 60 miles in a single day, consuming fuel and ammunition at a rate that outstrips anything the original invasion planning assumed any force could sustain this far from a port. The trucks on the road that night are the only thing standing between that advance and the kind of collapse that has ended fast-moving offensives before, in this war, and in the campaigns that shaped the doctrine behind them. 7 years earlier, a German general had written the book that first articulated, in systematic form, exactly the kind of speed the Allies are now achieving, the doctrine of concentrated armor moving faster than an enemy could react, breaking through and exploiting before a coherent defense could reform. That general had commanded the tip of that doctrine's spear in Poland, in France, and deep into Russia. And by the time his own name becomes attached to a verdict on the achievement unfolding on the roads of France in the late summer of 1944, he is not watching it happen from a headquarters in the West at all. He is hundreds of miles away, consumed by a catastrophe of his own on the opposite end of the continent, reaching his conclusion only long after the war that produced it has ended. The popular version of this story imagines Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, observing the American logistics effort in real time and remarking to colleagues that the enemy has solved a problem his own panzer forces never could. The documented record tells something more layered. By the time the operation later named the Red Ball Express begins running in the last days of August 1944, Guderian holds the position of Chief of the Army General Staff, appointed only weeks earlier, on July 21, 1944, the day after the failed attempt on Hitler's life, in the purge and reorganization of German military leadership that follows. His attention through these exact weeks is consumed almost entirely by a catastrophe considerably larger than anything unfolding in France: the destruction of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, a defeat inflicted by the Soviet summer offensive that begins in June 1944 and that cost Germany several 100,000 casualties in a matter of weeks, a disaster that many historians consider, in scale, to exceed even Stalingrad. Guderian has no operational responsibility for the Western Front in the late summer of 1944. That theater falls under a separate chain of command, and no documented wartime statement from him addresses the American supply achievement unfolding in France while it is happening. The assessment that gives this story its title comes instead from Guderian's own post-war memoir, Panzer Leader, published in the early 1950s, in which he reflects at length on the doctrine he helped create and, with the particular clarity available only in hindsight, on the one problem that doctrine never solved. To understand why that reflection carries the weight it does, the story has to begin with the doctrine itself, and the career of the man who did more than perhaps any other single officer to build it. Guderian's pre-war writing and advocacy, distilled most influentially into his 1937 book Achtung, Panzer, argue for a fundamentally different use of armored forces than most European militaries of the period had adopted. not tanks scattered in small numbers to support infantry advances, but concentrated armored formations, combined with motorized infantry, artillery, and close air support, driving deep and fast through an enemy's front before the defender can react coherently, then continuing to exploit the breakthrough rather than pausing to consolidate. It is a doctrine built entirely around speed and psychological shock, and when it is put into practice at scale during the invasion of Poland in September 1939, and again during the invasion of France in May and June of 1940, the results validate Guderian's pre-war theorizing almost beyond what even he had predicted. Guderian personally commands 19 Panzer Corps as it crosses the Meuse River at Sedan on May 13, 1940. A crossing German planners had originally expected to take several days of preparation, but that Guderian's forces, supported by concentrated Luftwaffe dive bomber attacks, substituting for artillery that had not yet caught up, force in a single afternoon against a French defensive sector considered secondary, rather than a likely point of main attack. From that crossing, Guderian pushes his panzer divisions west with a speed his own superiors initially consider reckless, repeatedly disregarding or reinterpreting orders to pause and consolidate in favor of continuing the advance, and reaches the English Channel coast near Abbeville within 10 days of the initial crossing, severing the Allied armies in Belgium and northern France from the bulk of French forces further south. It is a campaign that ends organized French resistance faster than anyone on either side of the war believed a major European army could be defeated. His reputation, by the summer of 1940, is unmatched among armored commanders anywhere in the world. What the doctrine never fully resolves, even at its moment of greatest triumph, is the question of how to sustain that speed once the initial breakthrough is achieved. German panzer divisions during the drive to the Channel in 1940 repeatedly outrun their own supply columns, forcing brief operational pauses that more cautious senior commanders, most notably during the famous halt order outside Dunkirk, used to argue for consolidation over continued exploitation, disputes that persist in various forms throughout the war whenever German armor achieves a breakthrough faster than its logistics tail can support. The problem recurs with far greater consequence during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941, in which Guderian commands Panzer Group 2 in a drive intended to reach Moscow before winter. German planning for the campaign's logistics, built around assumptions of a short, decisive campaign lasting only a few months, badly underestimates the fuel, ammunition, and vehicle maintenance requirements of sustained mechanized operations across the vast distances of Soviet territory, particularly once the road network, already far more limited and poorly developed than in Western Europe, deteriorates further under autumn rain and then winter conditions. The Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud that follows the autumn rains, and again the spring thaw across the Russian and Ukrainian countryside, turns unpaved roads into channels of axle-deep mud, capable of stopping wheeled and even tracked vehicles almost entirely. A natural obstacle that German logistics planners had accounted for only in general terms, rather than building into any detailed schedule for sustaining the advance. Compounding the problem further, the Soviet rail network runs on a wider gauge than the standard European track German logistics planning had relied upon, meaning captured Soviet rail lines cannot simply be used by German rolling stock without first being converted. A labor-intensive process that falls badly behind the pace of the advancing front and forces German logistics to rely far more heavily on truck transport over roads increasingly unable to support it than had ever been planned. German panzer spearheads reach within sight of Moscow's outer defenses by early December 1941. Exhausted, undersupplied, and operating with equipment badly worn by months of continuous advance, far beyond what German logistics planning had anticipated sustaining. The offensive collapses in the face of a Soviet winter counteroffensive that German forces, stretched to their logistical limit and, in many units, still equipped with summer uniforms and inadequate cold weather gear due to logistics priorities that had assumed Moscow would fall before winter set in, cannot adequately resist. Guderian himself is relieved of his command later that month, dismissed by Hitler following disagreements over tactical withdrawals in the face of the Soviet counterattack. A dismissal that removes him from active field command for more than a year. Guderian returns to a position of authority in February 1943, in the aftermath of the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, when Hitler appoints him Inspector General of Armored Troops, a role focused on rebuilding and reorganizing Germany's tank forces after losses that had gutted the Panzer arms' strength on the Eastern Front. It is a position concerned with production, training, and doctrine rather than direct field command, and it places Guderian in close, frequent contact with the industrial and logistical constraints that limit what German mobile warfare doctrine can actually achieve, regardless of how sound the underlying operational theory remains. Throughout this period and into 1944, Germany's overall military logistics remain heavily dependent on horse-drawn transport for the majority of the army's supply and artillery movement, even as panzer and motorized divisions demonstrate the kind of mechanized speed Guderian's pre-war doctrine had envisioned, a structural mismatch between the elite mobile spearhead and the much larger, far less mobile army it is meant to support and be supported by, one that Germany's limited automotive industry, strained by material shortages and competing wartime production priorities, is never able to fully correct. By some post-war estimates, well over half of the German army's total transport capacity across the war remained horse-drawn even at the height of the Wehrmacht's mechanized reputation, a statistic that runs directly against the popular image of German blitzkrieg forces as a uniformly mechanized juggernaut. In reality, a comparatively small number of elite panzer and motorized divisions carried the offensive spearhead, while the much larger bulk of the army marched and hauled its supplies at the pace of the 19th century, a gap Guderian understood intimately from his position overseeing armored forces, but that his authority as Inspector General was never sufficient to close. The same underlying problem had already played out on a smaller scale years earlier in North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps, however brilliantly it maneuvered against British forces, repeatedly found its offensives culminating not in tactical defeat, but in fuel exhaustion, forced to halt advances at the very moment breakthrough seemed within reach, because supply lines stretching back to distant Libyan ports could not keep pace with armor moving as fast as Guderian's doctrine demanded it should. It is against this backdrop of a doctrine that consistently outran its own logistics that the Allied breakout from Normandy, beginning with Operation Cobra in late July 1944, creates a nearly identical problem for the advancing American armies, one that the U.S. Army, unlike the Wehrmacht at any point in the war, manages to solve through sheer organizational and industrial improvisation. Following the capture of Avranches on July 30th and the activation of Patton's Third Army on August 1st, American forces begin an advance across France at a speed that immediately threatens to outstrip the supply system built around the original invasion plan, which had assumed a much slower, more methodical advance, supported by captured ports being brought back into operation in a planned sequence. Patton's divisions instead surge forward far ahead of schedule, and by late August, American forward elements are advancing dozens of miles daily, moving faster than the truck-based supply network feeding them from the Normandy beaches, and the few operational ports can keep pace with using existing transport arrangements. The French rail network, essential to any conventional logistics plan for supplying an army this size across this much territory, has been extensively damaged by Allied bombing in the months before and during the invasion, specifically targeted to disrupt German reinforcement and supply during the Normandy campaign, a strategic success that now becomes a serious complication for supplying the rapidly advancing Allied armies themselves, since the same rail lines that could no longer move German reinforcements forward can no longer move American supplies forward either. The solution that emerges, organized rapidly under the Communications Zone command structure responsible for Allied logistics in the European theater, becomes known as the Red Ball Express, a dedicated, one-way truck convoy system running on roads reserved exclusively for its use, marked with red ball signs borrowed from railroad terminology for priority freight, moving supplies continuously from depots near the Normandy beaches to forward distribution points feeding Patton's and other advancing armies. The plan is put together and set running within days of the need becoming clear, a testament to the flexibility of a logistics command structure able to reassign vehicles, drivers, and priority road access on short notice from across the entire theater rather than waiting for a solution to be planned and approved through slower channels. The operation begins running on August 25, 1944, employing at its peak more than 5,000 vehicles, predominantly the 2.5-ton GMC trucks that had become the workhorse of American Army transport, organized into convoys running around the clock in both directions on parallel routes to minimize collisions and delays, with military police and traffic control posts stationed at intervals along the route to keep the convoys moving and prevent the kind of bottleneck that could bring the entire system to a halt. A substantial majority of the drivers assigned to Red Ball Express duty are African American soldiers, reflecting the broader pattern of the U.S. Army's segregated organization at the time, in which black soldiers were disproportionately assigned to service and support units such as the Quartermaster Corps and Transportation Corps, rather than to combat arms regardless of individual qualification or preference. It is a pattern that runs through the entire structure of the wartime Army, in which segregated units performed essential, physically demanding work that rarely received the recognition given to frontline combat formations. Even though operations like the Red Ball Express were, by any honest accounting of the campaign, every bit as essential to the advance's success as the tank columns, whose progress depended entirely on the fuel and ammunition those trucks delivered. Whatever the discriminatory structure that produced this assignment pattern, the men driving those routes perform under conditions of extraordinary physical demand, long shifts with minimal rest, roads in poor repair and frequently congested, the constant risk of accidents from driving overloaded trucks at speed through the night with masked headlights, and, in the war's final push toward Germany, continued exposure to occasional German air attack and artillery fire on routes running close enough to the front to be within range. Drivers frequently report falling asleep briefly at the wheel during the longest stretches of continuous duty, a hazard commanders attempt to manage through rotating shift schedules and mandatory rest periods that, in practice, are not always strictly enforced given the relentless demand for supplies at the front. Over the roughly 3 months the Red Ball Express operates at full capacity, before the Allies finally secure and reopen sufficient port and rail capacity to reduce dependence on the truck route by mid-November 1944, the operation delivers several 100,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and other essential supplies to the advancing armies, a scale of sustained truck-based logistics that no army, including the Wehrmacht at any point in its most successful mobile campaigns, had previously organized and executed. The achievement comes at real cost, and with real limitations that keep it from being a complete or elegant solution. The trucks themselves consume a significant portion of the fuel they are hauling simply to make the round trip, a mathematical inefficiency inherent to any truck-based supply chain operating across the distances involved, with some estimates suggesting the operation consumed as much as a third of the fuel it hauled, simply moving itself back and forth along the route. Vehicle maintenance and attrition prove severe under the pace demanded, with breakdowns and accidents removing trucks from service faster than replacement and repair can fully offset, and engines run continuously at high load for weeks, at a stretch begin failing well before their expected service life, forcing maintenance crews working around the clock at collection points to cannibalize disabled vehicles for parts, simply to keep the convoys moving. And despite the scale of the effort, the Red Ball Express ultimately cannot fully solve the underlying supply crisis it was built to address. The broader strategic debate within Allied command through this period, between General Eisenhower's preference for a broad front advance and Montgomery's argument for concentrating supply priority behind a single narrow thrust into Germany, means fuel allocation decisions carry consequences for multiple advancing armies simultaneously, rather than simply reflecting how much the Red Ball Express itself is capable of physically delivering. By early September 1944, Patton's Third Army, its fuel allocation increasingly constrained as Allied Supreme Command diverts scarce fuel priority toward Montgomery's forces in the north in preparation for Operation Market Garden, finds its advance slowing and then largely stalling along the French and Belgian frontier, still short of the German border and the West Wall defensive line that German forces, granted the breathing room this pause provides, used the following weeks to partially reconstitute. Patton himself reportedly protests the reallocation in characteristically blunt terms, arguing that his own army stands closer to a decisive breakthrough into Germany than Montgomery's planned airborne operation is likely to achieve, an argument that history, given Market Garden's eventual failure to secure its final objective at Arnhem later that month, does not entirely vindicate Allied command for having overruled. The pursuit that had seemed, through August, capable of ending the war in the West before winter instead grinds to a halt, and the fighting that follows through the autumn and into the brutal winter battles still to come demonstrates that even the most successful logistics improvisation the war produces cannot fully erase the fundamental tyranny of distance that has constrained mechanized offensives on both sides throughout the conflict. It is precisely this combination, genuine, unprecedented achievement alongside real, unresolved limitation, that shapes Guderian's later reflection on the episode. Writing after the war, with access to neither classified wartime intelligence nor the benefit of having witnessed the operation firsthand, but with the professional perspective of the officer most responsible for articulating the original doctrine both armies were, in their different ways, attempting to execute, Guderian identifies the Red Ball Express and the broader American logistics effort supporting the 1944 breakout as proof of something German Panzer doctrine had promised operationally but never delivered organizationally: the capacity to sustain a fast, deep mechanized advance with a logistics system flexible and resourced enough to keep pace with it, at least for a period, even under conditions logistics planning had not originally anticipated. His own doctrine had demonstrated, in Poland, in France, and in the opening months of Barbarossa, that armored forces could break through and exploit faster than a defender could react. What that doctrine never solved, across every campaign in which Guderian personally commanded its execution, was how to keep that same force supplied once its own speed carried it beyond the reach of conventional supply lines, a limitation rooted not in any flaw in the operational concept itself, but in an industrial and logistical base that never matched the ambition of the doctrine built to exploit speed on the battlefield. The Americans, drawing on an automotive and petroleum industry operating at a scale no other combatant nation in the war could approach, along with an organizational culture willing to improvise a massive, temporary, purpose-built trucking operation on short notice and disband it just as quickly once the underlying infrastructure caught up, produce, however imperfectly and however briefly, exactly the kind of logistics flexibility Guderian's own pre-war theorizing had always assumed some solution would eventually need to provide. The weeks in which the Red Ball Express runs at its peak intensity are also, for Guderian personally, among the most difficult of his entire career, a fact that adds a particular weight to how he later frames the comparison. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive launched on June 22, 1944, deliberately timed to coincide with the third anniversary of Germany's own invasion of the Soviet Union, destroys Army Group Center almost entirely within weeks, inflicting losses that some post-war assessments place as high as several 100,000 men killed, captured, or missing. A collapse so total that it leaves a gap in the German Eastern Front hundreds of miles wide, with almost no organized force remaining to fill it. As Chief of the Army General Staff through August and September 1944, appointed to the position only days after the July 20th plot in a wartime reorganization that leaves him responsible for coordinating the Army's response to this catastrophe, his daily responsibilities center almost entirely on trying to stabilize a collapsing Eastern Front in the aftermath of Army Group Center's destruction, coordinating a fighting retreat across hundreds of miles of territory while managing an increasingly fraught relationship with Hitler, whose confidence in his senior generals has been further damaged by the July 20th assassination attempt and its aftermath, and whose suspicion toward the officer corps generally, following the plot's revelation of widespread disaffection among senior army officers, now colors every interaction Guderian has with Hitler's headquarters, even though Guderian himself had no role in the conspiracy. Hitler now demands rigid, no-retreat defense of positions that Guderian, drawing on the same professional judgment that had once made him Germany's foremost advocate for bold, flexible maneuver warfare, frequently considers untenable given the forces actually available to hold them. The strategic gulf between the two fronts in these exact weeks, an American army in the West struggling to outrun its own logistics during the most successful mobile advance of the entire war, and a German army in the East being pushed back at a comparable pace with logistics that had never remotely kept pace with the mobile doctrine's ambitions, even at Germany's military peak, captures, in miniature, the broader industrial and organizational disparity that has come to define the war's final year on every front. Back on the roads of France in the final days of August 1944, the drivers of the Red Ball Express have little sense that their exhausting, unglamorous work behind the front lines will one day be cited by name, by the very general whose doctrine first proved that speed alone could win battles, as the missing piece his own armored forces never managed to supply. They know only the schedule in front of them, the next collection point, the next unloading point, the next brief stop for fuel and food before climbing back behind the wheel for another stretch of darkened road. Many of these men had driven trucks or buses in civilian life before the war, a skill the segregated army had specifically sought out when assembling transportation units, and few of them could have imagined that the ordinary competence of holding a truck steady through a long night's drive would become, in its aggregate effect across thousands of vehicles and hundreds of miles, one of the decisive logistical achievements of the entire European campaign. Accidents claim trucks and, at times, drivers along routes pushed to capacity and beyond. Mechanical failures pull vehicles out of the convoy faster than repair crews working around the clock can return them to service. And still the convoys keep running, because the alternative, an advance that outruns its own supply, and stalls not from enemy resistance, but from empty fuel tanks and empty ammunition racks, is a failure every man on that road has been told, correctly, that their own effort is the only thing standing between the army ahead of them and exactly that outcome. Few of them will ever read Guderian's post-war memoir, and fewer still will recognize themselves in his analysis of what made the Allied advance of 1944 different from every mechanized offensive that preceded it, their names absent from the official histories and newsreels that, for decades afterward, would credit the breakout across France almost entirely to the tank columns and the generals commanding them. But the judgment he eventually commits to paper, however many years removed from the roads where it was earned, rests entirely on the unglamorous, exhausting, and largely uncelebrated work those drivers performed through the last days of that August and the weeks that followed. What the story of the Red Ball Express and Guderian's later verdict on it ultimately illustrates is a truth about mechanized warfare that operational brilliance alone can never fully address. That speed on a map is only as real as the fuel, ammunition, and spare parts required to sustain it, and that the army capable of solving the logistics of speed, not merely the tactics of it, holds an advantage no doctrine, however visionary, can fully offset without matching industrial and organizational capacity behind it. Guderian spent his entire career proving that fast, concentrated armor could shatter a front before an enemy could react. From the Meuse in 1940 to the outskirts of Moscow in 1941, and both campaigns bear his name as proof that the operational concept worked exactly as he had promised it would. He spent the final year of the war watching, from a headquarters consumed by a collapsing front on the opposite side of the continent, as an army built on an industrial base Germany could never match, solved the one problem his own doctrine had never been given the resources to answer, in a matter of weeks, and using nothing more sophisticated, in engineering terms, than trucks that had existed in essentially the same form since before the war began. The verdict he eventually delivers, in the calm and distance of a post-war study rather than the urgency of a wartime headquarters, is less a battlefield observation than a professional soldier's honest reckoning with the limits of even the best doctrine when the logistics behind it are never built to match its ambition. A reckoning that arrives, like so much of the clearest thinking to come out of the war's senior German commanders, only once the war itself has already decided the question for good, and that stands, in the end, as much a tribute to the drivers who solved the problem as it is a critique of the doctrine that never managed to.